Have you ever heard of those? There's so many things where they say there's two kinds of people, right? You're either this or you're that, right? There's thousands of two kinds of people. But I heard a great one this last week. It said there's two kinds of people, and it's as if someone is at a pizza party and they look around and see that there are a lot of people, so they take 3 pieces. Or the other kind of person is at the same party and looks around and sees all the people, and so therefore takes 1 piece. So 2 different kinds of people. Now we can throw those everywhere. As a Lutheran, we often like to use language that is both and. So I would suggest that depending on what day it might be, we might be the one grabbing 3 slices, or we might be the one grabbing 1. That is something that we wrestle with as broken human beings. We can't go through life saying, I'm a 1-slice person, but I can tell you seem to be a 3-slice person. But when we focus on others, as the gospel text does, we get a different sense of the world. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because there are a couple of things in the last week or so that I think kind of have informed the way in which I look at the text for today. One of the things that I find interesting about this text is that every once in a while there's maybe a single word that'll pop up in the text that you're like, that's just striking me funny, this one word. The one word in this gospel reading for today that really struck me as strange is the word it. Did you notice that? The word it. It's a weird word when you're using it to reference a child. Jesus took a child and put it in the midst of them. Now, like my computer is an it, right? My chair is an it. But a child really is not so much an it. I think if I was speaking about it, I would say Jesus grabbed a child and put them in the middle of the group, right? We would use a person kind of pronoun to describe a person, right? That would kind of make sense that we would do that. But that kind of got me spun into thinking of different events and things that I have been to. And it reminds me in particular of the installation of our new bishop in this synod a week ago, 8 days ago on Saturday. Our bishop, as you probably heard anywhere from BBC, CNN, our own publications, or whatever the case might be, is the first transgender bishop of any significant Christian tradition in the world. So it's a first. And so suddenly, in many corners, there is a wrestling with pronouns, right? What is the right pronoun? And the bishop has been helpful in suggesting that the pronoun they or them, like I might have chosen to use for the gospel text if I was on the writing team, which I don't want to be on the writing team, but if I was, that might be the one that I use. And so that's been a bit of my process. And it's interesting because there are times when you might say, well, that's a real pain. Why do I need to do that? But at the same time, that's when I focus on myself. That's when I'm grabbing 3 slices of pizza and say, well, hope there's some left for you. But when I'm moving through life in a way that is more oriented towards others, it invites me to consider those kinds of questions. Now, I'm going to circle back to the installation in a minute here, but when I hear the gospel reading for today, this one's very familiar to us, isn't it? First shall be last, a little child comes, Jesus is teaching the disciples. In this text, we are in Mark, where the disciples they're a little slow. They are not the sharpest crayons in the box. If you're looking for sharper disciples, you need to read a different gospel than Mark. And Jesus is most human in many ways in the Gospel of Mark. So Jesus is teaching them about the struggles that the Messiah is going to go through. And you'll notice rabbi, teacher, and disciples, students. As good students, they didn't understand, and so they chose to not ask any questions. So that sounds like a dodgy subject I don't even want to know anymore. So they started talking about maybe the weather, the local baseball team and what their standing is. They're kind of plodding along, and Jesus finally, when they get to Capernaum, turns around and says, "So, what have you been talking about along the way?" Along the way. In the Gospel of Mark, the way should almost be capitalized. It's an expression of this sense of movement, and the way goes to Jerusalem, ultimately, and across on a hill outside of Jerusalem. So what were you talking about along the way? And finally, one of them answers a little sheepishly, just which one of us was the most awesome? I mean, greatest, but that doesn't sound as silly as it sounds. I would, again, put my edit request for most awesome, right? Which one of us is the most awesome? But do you notice how that conversation is all focused towards self, right? There's a lot of learning that we do through life, learning about ourselves. Sometimes it takes a little perspective. Sometimes it takes a little jogging, perhaps, from somebody else. Or maybe it takes a different experience that's not our normal experience to cause us to step back and do a little self-reflecting and say, how have I been moving through this? What could I learn? When I was at the installation this last week, there were, as you might imagine, many, many dignitaries, both church-wise and politically. There were all kinds of people there. And then there was a group of ELCA pastors who were just there for the show on some level. We were there to dress up sharp and sit and sing loud, I think was mainly the kind of purpose. We didn't have specific jobs other than to process in and be part of the crew. I think there were about maybe 45, 50 of us or so that were coming in. And it was interesting being around my colleagues because we usually get together twice a year intentionally within the Synod. We get together in late spring for the Synod Assembly with our lay leadership, and we often, have a cup of coffee out in the hallway and are catching up and so on and so forth. And then in the fall, there's often a retreat with the bishop, the Professional Leaders Conference. And so we have these 2 points, but because of COVID, it had been 2 years. It had been since fall of 2019 that we had gathered. So between 2/3 of a face being covered and different hair and who knows what, it was sometimes hard to see who was who and recognize who was there and who was not. But there was a piece of self-learning that was kind of helpful. I don't imagine what all of the reasons for this might have been. I know people are busy, people are concerned about COVID and being in close spaces and so on and so forth. But knowing my colleagues as I do, I was kind of interested to the fact that as I processed in as a straight white man, I was probably about 10% of the clergy in that processional pool demographically. That's a radically different demographical percentage from when I started in ministry. Radically different. And it was interesting because it caused me to think about it. I've never thought about it before. Because usually when I go to church events, most people, and particularly people up front, look just like me. And so I don't think about it a whole lot. But at this event, suddenly I was thinking, I'm a little more aware of that. And moving through space, then I was thinking, I bet other people have been more aware about this through the years, All kinds of changes that we have when we are oriented towards others, when we recognize that others perhaps have an opportunity to be first, and we have perhaps an opportunity to be last, or at least not first, right? This is something that causes us to struggle at times. And when I read this text, I want to take it just one small step further. We could leave it as Christians as we should not be focused on ourselves, we should be focused on others. I would say that's maybe the shorthand version of it. Theologically, what I would like to suggest is that instead we should think of it as we should not be thinking of ourselves first, but we should be putting Christ first. And that in putting Christ first, we are not just putting others first, but in particular, we are putting others who often are at the margins first, just as Christ did. It's been interesting for me since the election of Bishop Rohr. I have had more than one parent contact me about the joy and grace that they have experienced in this due to issues related to a child in their home. I have never had that take place in other elections of our bishop. But I also, one other thing that I think we should be mindful of in regards to our bishop is that, as you might imagine, ugly things are said. It doesn't take too long to see on the internet, which we all know is just a bastion of positivity, right? But nonetheless, the bishop takes a lot of flack. I think there will be a lot of opportunities for us in this next 6 years to understand a different way of looking at the world, to understand a different way of being focused on Christ, to understand that our eyes might be opened, not in ways that we have chosen while we've been wondering which of us is the most awesome, but rather in the ways in which Christ calls us to open our hearts and our eyes as we move through this space and this life. So I'll conclude this text by saying, move away from ourselves, look towards Christ, that we might put others first. Amen.